One day a child is polite, respectful, and even predictable, and the next, moody, emotional, and impulsive. They have become a teenager. Now, the media and conventional wisdom might blame raging hormones and immaturity, but these are merely myths. And if you really want to know why teenagers do what they do or say what they say, we have to take a deeper dive into the teenage brain. Alright guys, welcome to Psych Explained. In this video, we're going to start out by examining two monumental changes occurring inside the adolescent brain. And that includes synaptic pruning and myelination. What we're also going to cover are all these claims that we hear about teenagers, like they're emotional and they're impulsive, or they're risk takers, or they're sluggish and sleepy, and what's happening inside the brain that makes people believe that these claims are true. Alright, let's start with the first one, synaptic pruning. Now let's actually break this word down into two parts. We have pruning. Now you might have heard the word pruning in terms of horticulture, agriculture, where you're kind of removing dead branches, right? You're pruning away at some sort of leaf or dead branch. We also have the word synaptic, which means synapse. Remember, when we have a neuron communicating with another neuron, there's a tiny microscopic space between two neurons called the synapse or synaptic junction. So what we're talking about is the cutting away of synaptic connections. But let's break that down further. I want you to think about all the information you consume from the time you're born, right? Reading and writing and math and language and communication and social cues and laws, right? You're consuming all this information about the world. Essentially what we're saying is you're getting all this general or generalized information from the world, like all this general information. And this is kind of creating all of these connections in the brain. Okay, all these connections from reading and writing and how to communicate with people and who my family members are, right? All these huge connections, like playing the piano. All right, so this kind of symbolizing the connections. But what happens as you get older is you realize you don't do everything you did when you were a kid. Maybe you played piano when you were 4, but you don't play piano when you're 13, 14 years old. So what happens? Well, synaptic pruning is based on the idea of use it or lose it. If I don't do it now, my brain says, let's get it away. It's not meaningful. It doesn't matter. I don't need it to be a connection in my brain. So let's cut it away. So essentially what we're saying is, like an hourglass, your information and knowledge in the brain gets more specialized. It gets more narrow as you get older. So we go from generalized to specialized. Okay? And when this happens, what the brain does is going to cut away those connections that we don't use anymore. All right, so let's write this in together. What is synaptic pruning? It is the elimination of what? Elimination of unused synaptic connections. Okay, and let's actually underline our key phrase here, which is unused, right? Based on the principle, use it or lose it. All right, and why do we do this? Okay, why does synaptic pruning occur? Well, it increases efficiency. Increases efficiency. Okay, so let me give kind of a real life example, okay? Imagine that you have Wi-Fi at home, right? And throughout your life, you're making all these connections to your Wi-Fi. You have iPads, and you have cell phones, and you have watches, right? You're connecting everything to Wi-Fi. But as you get older, you realize you don't use all these devices anymore. You don't use all these iPads. You don't use all these phones. What do you got to do? You got to unplug it because the Wi-Fi signal isn't as strong. You don't use these devices anymore, so we have to prune it. We have to cut it away. So as opposed to this structure, right, what pruning is going to really look like is something like this, right? Much more efficient. It's going to look much more organized, and the brain is going to work much, much better, right? Synaptic pruning. All right, that's our first one. What else is happening inside the adolescent brain? What we also have is a process called myelination. Now, to understand myelination, we have to understand the neuron. So what are the parts of a neuron? Do we remember? Well, let's use my hand as an example, right? We have our tree branches, our dendrites that receive the message. We have our soma, the cell body. We have our axon that carries the action potential, right? That's the electrical signal away from the soma. And then the axon terminal is what contains the neurotransmitters. So we have our dendrite, soma, axon, and terminal. So what's the most important structure here? It's this structure here, the axon, that carries the action potential away from the soma. Why is that important? Well, remember, think about danger evolution. the brain and the nervous system has to work really, really fast, right? The faster it is, we can escape danger. If you smell something burning, you got to run to it. Things have to work fast. And throughout your life, your brain and nervous system is getting faster and faster and faster thanks to myelination. So what is actually happening here? What we're really talking about is the formation of something. And we're talking about the formation of something called myelin. Okay, and it's in the word, myelination. Formation of myelin around what structure? Around the axons of individual nerve cells, right? Neurons. So what would this look like? Well, it would look something like this. Okay, these kind of fatty white substance, and I don't have white here, but it's brown, this fatty white substance that surrounds the axon. And what this does is it speeds up the signal. And this is going to happen throughout our life to make sure things go really, really fast. Now, there's a little bit more to this. And actually, let's write this in together. So why do we have this? To increase speed. To increase the speed, right? The signal, right? And this could be 100 times faster with myelination, with myelin, okay? Now what I also have here are two sections of the brain. I have the entire brain, the entire cerebrum, with the cortex, right, all the wrinkled layers on top. And if you cut the brain in half just like this is what it will look like on the inside. And the reason this is important because if you ever heard the expression gray matter or white matter, what we're really referring to are myelinated axons and unmyelinated axons. Un means that you don't have that myelin. So this would be gray matter. Okay, this is the cortex, the outer cortex, and this would be what we consider unmyelinated. Okay, I'll put that in parentheses. All right, so that's the cortex. The wrinkled layer, it's all unmyelinated, which means there's no myelin, right? It's just somas and cell bodies. And then we also have, if I, cut this in half, right here, cut that in half, what we would see is something called, I'll use a different marker, is white matter. White matter. And instead of unmyelinated, we have myelinated. Okay, so these are myelin axons, and that would be what's in the middle. So we have unmyelinated and myelinated. In fact, you could actually see the gray matter on the outside right here, right? And you have white matter in your brain, your cerebrum makes up most of the brain, in your central nervous system, because we want information to go really, really fast. All right, so there we go. We have our two big processes during teenage life. We have pruning and myelination. All right, let's tackle these claims. We'll start with emotional and impulsive. All right, so let me grab the brain for this. Now, when we talk about teens are emotional and impulsive, we have to understand what's happening in the brain. Most importantly, the brain develops from back to front. Let me repeat that. The brain develops from back, the occipital lobe, all the way to the front, which is our frontal lobe. So we have our occipital lobe, our parietal lobe, which is on top, our temporal lobes, which is on the sides, and our frontal lobe. Now, why is that important? As we talk about pruning and myelination, right, we have cutting away of unused synapses and the speeding up of impulses. Well, if it starts in the back of the brain where vision is taking place and touch and pressure on top and hearing on the side, well, what this means is that the front is the last part to experience it. Why is that important? Because the front is where we have executive functioning, higher order thinking. This is the CEO of the brain. This is what we call the prefrontal cortex. This is what is rational thought and controls our impulses, it regulates emotions. It's the thing that says, maybe we shouldn't do this. This is maybe a bad thing, right? It's too much risk taking, right? That's the last thing to develop. So what develops before that? Well, if I take this apart, what you'll see on the inside is a lot of structures here. And this area represents something called the limbic system, or the limbic area. And this is a system that's the center of emotions and frustration and anger and all those strong feelings that we have. This is the limbic system. This develops before the part of the brain that says, I don't think we should do this, right? So think about that. Emotions mature before the part of our brain that says, we should probably think about the consequences of our actions, right? So this is really important to know. All right, so let's visualize this together, all right? So we have our two structures. We have our prefrontal cortex, which sits right in front, right? And we have our limbic system, which sits right in the center, okay? And let's actually focus on the limbic system first, okay? And I'll write that in. We have our limbic system, okay? And the limbic system is made up of many areas. the hippocampus, which helps form explicit memories. We have our hypothalamus, we have our thalamus. But the most important structure within the limbic system, and I'll write limbic system up here, limbic system, and I'll kind of have a nice little arrow pointing down here. The most important structure is this one right here that I'm going to kind of highlight in green. Okay, this little kind of almond-shaped structure. You know what that's called? This is called the amygdala. Amygdala. Okay, and this structure, the amygdala, is really the center of emotion, right? If you ever feel angry or like your brain is saying, okay, there's danger over here, that's your amygdala kind of firing on all cylinders saying we should be wary, okay? This is really what the limbic system is about. So a couple things to think about. So our limbic system is highly emotional, okay? Highly emotional. Rather than waiting for things, it wants it in now. We call that immediate gratification, right? Give it to me now, right? Feels good. Your brain's going to say, I can't wait for it, right? And then also just kind of this general thing of kind of going with your gut feeling, right? This is really what the limbic system is, okay? And we visualize this on this graph right here, and we'll stick with the color green. Here's my limbic system. The limbic system, here's maturity and age. The limbic system matures relatively quickly, okay? So this might be, 12 years old or 13 years old, or with puberty, kids are doing this much earlier, right? So this is the limbic system. It's emotional, it wants it now, and it mostly goes with our gut feeling. But what about our prefrontal cortex right here in brown? Our prefrontal cortex. Well, let's contrast this with the limbic system. Rather than emotional, this is really the rational part of our brain, right? It's the thinking center, right? So we kind of think through things a little bit more, right? Rather than immediate gratification, it's impulse control, right? If I want something, that doesn't mean I have to get it right now. I can control my impulses, impulse control. And rather than going with our gut feeling, the prefrontal cortex kind of, weighs the risk and reward. Is it really worth it, rather than going with my gut feeling? Now, prefrontal cortex also regulates our emotions and other functions, but I thought this was a nice contrast. And in terms of maturity, rather than having, and I'll have brown here, instead of maturing very quickly, our prefrontal cortex takes a little time to mature, right? And it might be 25 years old, right? This may be 25 years old when it actually matures. So this space right here, right, is really the difference in terms of impulse control and regulating our emotions, right? That's the difference, the mismatch, how much mismatch there is really shapes our decision making, right? And I said before, kids are going through puberty early today. So this might be happening, right? Our limbic system might be maturing even earlier because of that, right? All right, so there's kind of a nice difference. So emotions, impulses. All right, another big claim of teenagers is that they're risk takers. And this is slightly true, and it's not a bad thing. This deals with evolution. We'll talk about this one. Now, in terms of risk taking, this isn't a bad thing all the time, okay? Think about this. If you're a teenager and you raise your hand in class and you have a question or an answer, right? You're putting yourself at risk to be humiliated. Or if you ask somebody to prom or dance, right? We always think of risk-taking as a bad thing, but in terms of evolution, risk-taking gets us out of the house, right? Out of the nest. So it's actually a good thing. But the problem is you can also make bad decisions. Now, there's a chemical in the brain that's really at the center of risk-taking. Do you know what that is? The chemical is called dopamine, okay? Dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's about pleasure and reward. And when you do something good and you feel like you want to do it over again, that is dopamine motivating you to do that, right? It's the impulse to make you do that. And during our teenage years, we have a lot of dopamine, there's our D for dopamine, impacting our limbic system, okay? So we're making decisions not based on our prefrontal cortex and rational thought, but emotions, okay? That's kind of what to think about. And here's just a nice example, right? Imagine, for example, we have a child, a teen, and an adult. Okay, this is just showing just the power of dopamine. And all of them post a picture to social media, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, whatever it is, right? Well, how much dopamine is going to be released? Well, for a child, it might be this much. For an adult, it might be this much. And what about for a teen? Well, this is going to be this high. In other words, the release of dopamine is much more intense for an adolescent, okay? Which means it explains why they might do more riskier things because you have that surge of dopamine making you want to do it over and over and over again. Now, in terms of dopamine, a couple of things to think about. It also affects our decision making, right? It reaches the cortex. So our dopamine influences our emotions, which in turn influence how we process and think about situations. Now, there's 3 things I want to consider for dopamine, okay? 3 things that make us take more risks that's connected to dopamine. One, as we just said, is reward. When something is rewarding, we're gonna do it again and again and again. Now, that could be a good thing, but imagine driving in a car going 100 miles an hour, right? That could be really fun and rewarding, but it's also really dangerous, and that's why teenagers are at the highest risk for having car crashes. So it's rewarding, it's fun, but could also lead to risk-taking, right? Another one is novelty. Novelty, okay? And novelty means doing things that are new, right? And for teenagers, everything is new and exciting, right? Hanging out with a new friend group, joining a club. It could be, I don't know, going skydiving, bungee jumping, going to a dance that you've never been before, right? This is novelty. If it's newer, the adolescent, right, really wants to do it. All right, the last one that dopamine really influences in terms of risk-taking is peers. Our peers and our friends have so much influence over our behavior. Let me give you a great example, okay? So here's a famous study where we have teens and adults driving in a simulation, right? They're driving down the road, and the idea is to get to the end of the road as quickly as possible. And if you do, you get a monetary reward. Now, there's also yellow lights that you run through, and you can go through those yellow lights, but the risk is greater because you might get in a car crash. So how does this work? Well, in this study, and I'll use green for alone, what they found is when teens and adults are driving alone, they roughly have the same amount of risks, right? They go through the yellow light roughly the same amount of times. But what happens if your friends are watching? If your friends are watching, or even if you just think they're watching and they're not, right? Adults relatively make the same amount of risks. But with teens, skyrockets. It's almost as if the presence of your peers changes the circuitry of your brain, right? It makes you want to take more risks, you have a bigger boost of dopamine, and you're going to get maybe in more trouble. So that's a really wonderful study to kind of showcase the power of our peers. All right, here's the last one. Teens are sleepy and sluggish. Now, as a teacher of teenagers, I know all about this, okay? And let me just say this. If you're a teenager watching, it's not necessarily your fault. All right, here's what we need to know. In terms of sleepiness, there's a few terms we need to know. One of them is called circadian rhythm, okay? So let's write that in together. Our circadian, okay, I'm gonna write something else with the circadian rhythm, but we'll start with this one, okay? Your circadian rhythm is your internal biological clock. Have you ever noticed that you feel hungry at certain times of the day or stressed at certain times of the day, right? Your body is on this clock. And you could also feel sleepy at certain times of the day. And when you're a child, and I'll kind of draw this in here, M is for melatonin. Melatonin is released when we are feeling sleepy. And actually, I'll kind of backtrack to make sure we know this. Here's kind of our gland that controls sleep. This is called our pineal gland, named because it looks like a pine cone. Our pineal gland, I'll erase that. And that's right here. So we have darkness hitting the eye, right? Information goes from the eye up to the brain, to the thalamus, and finally to the pineal gland. This is going to release melatonin. When you're a kid, okay, we'll highlight this with children, okay, your melatonin is going to be released around maybe 8 p.m. I'm just kind of giving a take here, right? And then as it increases, you know, it's going to stop around, 7 or 8 a.m. So you have this kind of surge of melatonin, and this is like, I need to get up, right? But what happens when you're a teenager? When you're a teenager, your circadian rhythm shifts. I said earlier, this is not your fault. And what this means is that there's essentially a delay. I'll write, a sleep phase or a melatonin delay of when it's released, okay? So if we kind of visualize this together, and I'll use brown, once you hit puberty, 12, 13, maybe even earlier, 9, 10 years old, all of a sudden you switch to maybe 9, 10, 11 p.m. when the melatonin starts to release. So for a teenager, our melatonin chart might look something like this, okay? Now, any problem with this? Yeah, kids go to school, right? School, you have to wake up around here, for school, right? So what we're kind of referring to is you kind of have this huge gap, use a different color, you kind of have this huge gap between when your melatonin stops being released and when you have to get up, right? And this might explain why kids are sleep deprived and that they're moody or emotional, right? In a sense, this connects to these two claims as well. So if you want to think why teens are sleepy, there is some biological reasons. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe. See you next time.